Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for this crucial conversations about the future of democracy promotion in the Middle East and beyond. I'm Dania Arayssi. I'm non-resident senior fellow at the New Alliance Institutes for Strategy and Policy, and here we have my colleagues Henry. I've spent a lot of time working with Henry on this project on democracy promotions in the Middle East. And the main question that we were primarily thinking about it is why did traditional democracy promotion frameworks fail to anticipate an uprising such as the Arab Springs? And what can we do better to understand this question? And so to answer these questions, we worked together on this project and particularly on these reports looking at how institutional trust or patterns or relationship between institutions really can be helpful to understand and predict when an uprisings or a certain sentiments toward the government is likely to happen. Today, we're going to be joined with our panelist. One of our panelists is a little bit delayed in the joining, Dr. Amani Jamal, but I would like to welcome our panelist, Sarah, Dr. Sarah Yerkes. Thank you for joining us from Carnegie. Dr. Sarah is a senior fellow in the Middle East programs at Carnegie Endowments for International Peace, where her research focuses on democracy and governance, U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East and North Africa, and political and economic reforms in Tunisia. She's a former member of the State Department's policy planning staffs, where she focused on North Africa and previously served as foreign affairs officer in the State Department's Office of Israel and Palestinian Affairs. She has been a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institutions and the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellows. So thank you for joining us. First we're going to start by Henry and I. We're going to be doing quick presentations overview about the report, and then we're going to kick the conversation with our panelists, and hopefully our other panelists will be able to join us by the time. So,
thank you all for being here.
Thank you. So should we start the presentation?
Yes, can you give us 2 minutes, please?
I will try and share my screen. Go ahead.
I'll let Dania take it away.
Yes, sure. To begin with, the main research question of this project is why traditional democratization metrics really fail to predict revolutions or uprisings in fragile states. We were looking into the traditional democracy framework that the United States has been using in the Middle East, and we were trying to understand why those frameworks or those metrics that we have been using are not enough to tell us when those uprisings going to happen. Instead of having kind of this reactive reaction, we wanted to be more predictive for those uprisings. And so we looked at the trust in the governments, in government, civil society, and political parties, and we found that there is a variations in how individuals really refer to those institutions. And we wanted to use those variations as a predictive for when the government or when an uprising is likely to happen. So we can use these variations to understand when an uprising is likely to happen. So we looked at civil society, governments, and political parties. And so, for example, if we look at the political parties, we can see the high number of people who do not trust political parties in the government. In a situations like Tunisia, if you do not trust a political party, how are you likely to vote or participate in the elections? If you don't trust a political party. On the other hand, there's a very limited number of people who also trust civil society organizations. So those variations can be predictive on when likely an uprising or protest is likely to happen. And so strong civil society were seen as a sign of democratic stability. But in this project, we wanted to emphasize that strong trust in civil society is not necessarily an indicator of stability in the regimes. It depends on the context of when those trust is likely to happen. Like what is the context shaping those trust in civil society? And so the conventional understandings of democratizations is that strong trust in civil society is an indicator of regime stability. But in the context of Tunisia and Algeria, we found that this is not necessarily the case. It could be a sign of an uprising because it comes with a distrust with the government. It's important not just study those images separately from each other, but study the whole big picture. You trust civil society at the expense of what? At the expense of distrusting the government, distrusting the political party. So this is kind of the main idea. It's like civil society is trusted where political institutions are not, and it's really fueling mobilizations and uprisings. So the next slide
is our methodology. We felt it was important to do structured interviews with civil society leaders and policy practitioners in Tunisia, Lebanon, and Egypt. On top of this, for our quantitative data, we used the Arab barometer and we used numbers from 2010 to 2011 and then followed those with numbers from 2023 to 2024. We did this with 6 countries across the Middle East, and we also utilized open source information for our case studies, which we're going to get into for a little bit. That includes reports, blogs, public polls, things across the internet that we could source together. Our analytical methods, as I just said, we're going to bring up some case studies that we used in Tunisia and Egypt to show the difference in these different types of roles, as well as the nuance and importance of a deep understanding and trust and a political institution's place in society relative to that trust. Our logistical factor analysis was we used regression models linking institutional trust to political behavior, including voting and polls. Thank you. Oh, of course, our lessons learned were that civil society can mobilize and stabilize. It's not clear from data alone, as well as trust across all institutions is just as important as trust in the central government. Trust across the judiciary, civil society, the military, diversified trust profile creates a trend towards democratization, not just centralized trust. Some more interesting information is that men and women often trust institutions differently. Women place relatively higher trust in courts and civil society, while men place higher trust in the military and police institutions. This has to do with higher interactions, roles, and different employment opportunities, and general media perception that's placed on these people. When we combine surveys with local voice, we show that trust shifts over time, and it's important to monitor over time. Thank you.
Yep. And then the next slide, we're looking into the puzzle, the main research question puzzle here. That why trust in institutions matters to understand uprisings and to understand protests in those countries. And so looking at those figures, this is the data from the Arab barometer for 2010-2011. And if we look at the first figure, is like the probability of protest. The probability of protest tend to increase in countries where there is low government trust in those economies, and as well as a high civil society trust. So if you trust the civil society, but you do not trust the government, your likelihood to protest is increasing significantly. On the other hand, is also if this is for 2010-2011 data. We wanted to see if the conclusion still holds 10 years, 12 years after the Arab Spring. So what we did is we took this data and we tested this data for 2023, 2024 to see if are we still holding the same conclusions. Does low trust in government and high trust in civil society tell us that people are more likely to protest? And yes, it does still hold. And this is across 6 countries. So this is to increase our external validity or the external applications of this argument, that if you do not trust the government, but you trust civil society to a certain extent, you're more likely to protest. And so this is an indicator that it's important not to study trust separately from each other. We need to study trust in institutions in a big picture to know when an uprising is likely to happen, and then what the United States or other policymakers can do to intervene to avoid such instability or violence from happening. Because eventually we want people to participate in politics through voting. We want this conventional, we want stability, and we want them to feel represented. And so we want to avoid protests from occurring and this kind of contentious political action from happening. And so we're trying to use these frameworks to predict when those actions are likely to be. And so the importance of this is civic engagement or trust in civil society can stabilize or destabilize regimes. And so it's important to disaggregate the institution of trust across different political institutions. We can go to the next slides. Okay, perfect. And so here, for example, we looked at a probability of protest for 2010-2011 for the Arab barometer data. And this is across different institutions. So the civil society, the judiciary, the governments. So how trust in those different institutions tell us if people are likely to protest or if likely to vote. And so what we found is civil society trust. Citizens who trust civil society a bit more are slightly more likely to protest. If you trust civil society compared to the government, you're more likely to protest, because in those conditions, in that situations where you have non-democracy or voting is not perceived as an effective way to express your opinion, you're likely to go to civil society organization to express your opinion because it's an alternative way, a more efficient way than the government voting, given that there is institutional corruption. And so, and such approach comes with high government trust as well. On the other hand, if we look at the other photo, we found that if you trust the government, you're less likely to protest. And I think this is very makes sense, right? I mean, if you trust the government, you trust the institutions, why would you protest, right? Your alternative methodology should be voting, because you trust what the government is doing and you trust the institutions. And I think this is very important to know when people are protesting, when people are going to vote, and so we know what is really the trajectory of those countries. We also wanted to study how the trust, not only in the civil society or the government, but also the police and the judiciary really impact those relationships. And so we found that high trust in the police tend to be associated with also lower probability of protesting, right? If you trust the police, why would you protest? Instead, you really seek other alternative ways to communicate your concerns. On the other hand, very interesting here is the judiciary. High trust in the judiciary tend to be accompanied with high protest. This is very important because if you trust the judiciary, you feel like, yes, I might be taken to the judiciary, and I might be taken to be in the judiciary, but I trust that I'm going to be receiving a fair treatment, which is important here. In certain conditions, this is a critical point. So those are how different trusts in different institutions tell us how people are likely to behave, and this is a predicting based on survey data collected from the Arayssi. Okay, perfect. The next slides, we were also, so this is for voting, for protesting. Now we're looking at how the trust in these institutions tell us if people are likely to vote. Also predicting are likely to vote. So not only protest, which is a contentious political action, but more like a traditional relationships are voting. So civil society is a very important indicator here. They can mobilize and demobilize people from voting. They have a lot of influence on the people to push them on the streets and to tell them if they want to vote for this person or that person. And this is shown with the data. High trust in civil society can increase voting behavior. On the other hand, something very important here is high trust in the government increase voting, which is what I was saying before. That the government really is an important relationship here. If you do not trust the government, you're likely going to take a contentious action. On the police and the judiciary, it's very also interesting to see that high trust in the judiciary tend to be associated with high voting. And so the major implications here is citizens appear to engage really in voting when they view non-political institutions, and here I'm talking about civil society, as very effective and trustworthy, but they feel skeptic about the government and other institutions. The next slide is I think about Tunisia.
So as I was mentioning before,
Can we just move to the next?
So as I mentioned before, we felt it was important to go past these numbers and develop nuanced case studies on what these numbers meant, the places these institutions held in society, and how that affected the democratization outcome. When it comes to Tunisia, there's a few main factors that we find important. You have a really robust civil society. You've got a very mixed judiciary profile, and we're going to come to its full profile on the next slide. And then you have this common perception of Tunisia is the success of the Arab Spring, but now with an asterisk with the recent democratic backsliding. A lot of this credit is given to civil society. A lot of this credit is correctly given to civil society. And we can see that civil society is important because we've seen a systemic attack on civil society by President Kais Saied. He actually comes from a constitutional lawyer organization and has learned that civil society is a democratizing indicator and trend creator, and has pushed back against it. Now, if we come to the profile on the next slide, the trust profile of Tunisia, we will find that you've got a medium trust in central government, very low trust in political parties, which Dania already discussed earlier, low trust in internal security apparatus, the police, low trust in judicial, high trust in legal profession, mixed trust in independent civil society. The reason that this doesn't tell the full picture is because, for example, if we come to the judiciary and the civil society, you've got mixed trust because you have organizations like the UGTT, which is the largest union in Tunisia. It's a massive union, over 1 million members before the Arab Spring, has very high trust, has an internal culture of democracy, but then it's pushed back against by the UCITA, which is the employers' union, which was a union very in line with the regime. And that's going to create a mixed trust profile if you aggregate civil society. So you need to have a nuanced perspective and understand the different organizations. Then if we pivot to the judiciary, leading up to the Arab Spring itself, the judiciary had become co-opted by the regime, by Ben Ali. He had turned it into an arm of the regime, using it to crack down on dissent. However, Tunisia has a long history of a strong judiciary. You have judges that are well trusted, you have lawyers that are well trusted. A big contributor to the revolution is a large class of young lawyers that are unemployed and feel disenfranchised by the judicial system. This mixed trust profile doesn't tell you that. You need to understand the nuanced perspective of the judiciary in society. And we're going to come, and that judiciary legitimizes the transition, which then allows, which is not told from this profile, because those independent figures, those independent actors are then able to legitimize the transitionary process. If we come to our next case study, Egypt, we see a different type of civil society. We see a civil society that's held under the thumb of the regime. We see a major organization, a civil society organization, ostracized and pushed to the side, the Muslim Brotherhood, which has strong trust for the people, but's been separated from the regime. You've got a pattern developing of military autocracy, revolution, military autocracy. You've got a military which is deeply ingrained in the economy. You've got a military that's deeply ingrained with the history of the country over the last 70 years. And you've got major roadblocks to democracy because of that. If we come to the Egyptian trust profile, on the next slide, we're going to focus on two things. We're going to focus on the armed forces, which, if you remember with the Tunisian profile, also possessed very high trust. The difference between this is that if you just look at high trust, you see they both have very high trust. What's important to understand is the role of the armed forces in the different regimes and how that affects democratization and stability indicators. The Egyptian armed forces, as I just mentioned, are deeply integrated in the economy. You've got figures like Nasser attached to Egyptian nationalism and Egyptian identity, compared to the Ben Ali regime leading up to the Arab Spring, where you have the military pushed to the side. You've got an ostracized military because of paranoia of coup, because of being afraid of military becoming too strong. Those are two really highly trusted institutions, but two very different democratization outcomes because of that. And then, as described by Dania earlier, this political parties and government difference is really important. If you just look at the central government, you see relatively high trust, especially compared to Tunisia. But then you look at political parties, and if you don't have someone to vote for, you don't feel represented, and you're more likely to protest. We see that as a strong trend line. Thank you. So for our policy recommendations, we felt that you need to move beyond a one-size-fits-all approach. This is de-aggregating trust across political institutions. This is understanding that every country needs its own individual profile that needs to be correctly ascertained and correctly understand. Not just saying, oh, strong civil society equals democracy, let's just invest in large civil society organizations. Following this, we felt that established trust monitoring systems, as I just said, you need to have profiles for countries. We need to build models that can track trust shifts and use them as early warnings for instability. The Arab Spring should not have been a surprise for the US foreign policy establishment, but it was, and this is a really great way to prevent that. Having trust monitoring systems, understanding the judiciary and its role in increasing protests, but also increasing voter turnout, and how that can affect stability and how that can affect democratization. Dania, would you like to take the last two?
Yes, and I want to just update everyone that Dr. Amani Jamal just responded to me, and she might be able to join from 12:30 to 1 to make comments. There was some problem with her calendar invites, with the meeting invitations on her end. So that's good news. Yes, so the other policy recommendations that we really wanted to highlight here is that redesigning democracy promotion funding based on trust profiles. And what I mean here is when we are trying to establish or push for a democracy in those economies that are less democratic, I think it's very important it's very important to be context specific. Democracy and the definition of democracy should be based on what the context and the community needs and how they want to perceive what is democracy instead of just imposing a one size fits all. And so in this case, we are suggesting that maybe we should study trust relationships and trust profiles and how communities really perceives the relationship with the government, and then based on how communities and individuals perceive democracy and perceive the relationship with the people, we can then do the essential funding that we need for those relationships. So for example, to give a scenario, in a community where people do not trust the judiciary or they do not trust the police, maybe we should invest more in those institutions and help build this community funding for those institutions instead of just distribute funding all over like the country or civil society. Maybe civil society is not what we need to be investing in. And so it's important, this is why we're suggesting to studying those relationships across institution and trust relationship will help us know where we should put the money and where we should invest. So I think this is very important. And then the last comment here is use trust data for predictive, not reactive policy. And so what we're trying to say here is that maybe we should not be just investing in in democracy in those economies just randomly, and instead we can start building data and use the Arab barometer data or use other establishing data survey to try to study trust across these institutions to be proactive, to be predictive, and not to have a reactive surprising effect. So start to get ready and to avoid those uprisings from happening. And so this is what we're trying to mean by predictive, not reactive. It's like trying to be prepared to avoid those uprisings from happening. Because, for example, Tunisia was considered the jasmine examples of the Arab revolutions. But the problem that happened is that there was a backsliding in Tunisia, and because of backsliding, Tunisia is no longer a democracy. I mean, it's less likely to be considered a democracy right now because we failed to continue investing in those institutions. And that happened to having failed situations in Tunisia right now. And so this is the importance of establishing those trust profiles to avoid backsliding and to avoid those uprisings from happening. So yeah, those are the two key policy recommendations. And then I guess right now we can start with the conversation and the event with Dr. Sarah. Can you give us first insights about this project, with the first reactions or impressions about this project?
Sure. No, I think it's really interesting, and I appreciate the sort of the nuance that you guys provide. I agree with a lot of your overall findings, in that there does need to be more of a sort of nuanced approach towards democracy promotion in general. You know, that each country, each situation, each year, you know, is sort of a different case, and trying to figure out, you know, how do you actually get in and get the knowledge and the information to be able to better apply funding, I think is a very good idea. And I think, you know, there's the two cases, Egypt and Tunisia. Obviously, there's a lot of differences, and I think you really point well to the idea of the role of the military is so crucial in explaining especially the very initial outcomes of, you know, that the people, the fact that the military in Tunisia was really, as you said, you know, sort of disadvantaged, was pushed off to the side. That really helps explain why the military itself was willing to not participate in the oppression against protesters, why the military did stay to the side, versus in Egypt, where the military was one of the main actors during the revolution in a harmful way, and you know, then became, it continues to be one of the main actors in the country. And sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here, what else I wrote down here. But yeah, no, I think there's a lot there, and I'm sure we'll unpack a lot more of it.
Perfect. I think I want to start with you on one of the questions is more about the early warning signs in Tunisia. So Tunisia was celebrated by the Arab Spring as a successful story throughout the 2010. But looking back at the trust data and from that period, from 2010-2011, where you think in your research, because I know you worked also in Tunisia, were there any early signs of any democratic backsliding that US could have anticipated or kind of interfered in Tunisia to avoid from all these consequences of the democratic backsliding there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so in the very early period, in the 2010-2011 period, I mean, there's a lot, guess, it's very common that there's a lot of instability, that transitions are messy. Transitions often cause economic backsliding, and I think that's one of the things that we often don't really capture well is the fact that Tunisians started the revolution not about politics, they started it about economics.
Right.
So the people that, the demands that were initial were really, it's about dignity, it's about corruption, but it's really about the fact that in the interior regions where the revolution started, people didn't feel like the government was delivering for them. They could see this massive kind of socioeconomic disparity between what they were experiencing and even just what people in Tunis were experiencing. And so then the revolution moves to Tunis and it kind of gets co-opted by people who wanted democracy, not that the other people didn't, but that wanted to have a more political flavor to the revolution. And so I think, when in the early years of the transition, the emphasis was placed on the political transition instead of the economic transition. And that I think was a big mistake, and it is something I don't know, I hesitate to say mistake because I don't know that I would have advised to do it differently. If you run the risk of if you start the economic transition, you never get to the political transition. But I do think that was one of the early red flags that, really, and there was a lot of pressure on this. I mean, the US, Europe were really telling the Tunisians, you need to do both. You really need to tackle the economic situation as well. But it was very hard to do that. I mean, they didn't really have the resources to do both, and so they chose to prioritize the politics. And as a result, people didn't feel like democracy was meeting their needs. So they really wanted democracy to deliver food and jobs, and that was something that wasn't doing. And so as we move forward, in the next decade, that was something that President Said was able to capitalize on to say, look, democracy's not working. You guys, you wanted unemployment to go down, you wanted to have more food, you wanted to have a better economic situation. This didn't do it for you. Let me show you another way. And I think that was one of the things he did very well.
That's really interesting because recent report by the Arab Barometer, recent one, they got published. They're talking about this, the idea that democracy is not election.
Yes.
And maybe we need to talk about something else. Maybe we need to talk about people putting food on the tables and afford having basic needs. Henry, I know you worked about Tunisia and Egypt a lot, and you work on military institutions in those countries. And so I have a question more about if you can walk us through the key trust pattern differences that explain, based on the case study that you did, why Tunisia achieved democratic transitions, why, for example, Egypt returned to a military authoritarianism, and what was the most revealing findings from your competitive analysis? I know you did a case study on both of them.
I think that's a great question, and I think it almost ties into yours. If you look at U.S. funding to Tunisia through that period, you have that initial $100 million to the Tunisian government, and then you have a majority of the funds, sometimes 80-90% of the funding going to counterterrorism, the Tunisian military, which is going to be strengthening that military that's ostracized, and also not supporting the economy, which is something that was so key during the transition, which you brought up. But when it comes to the key differences between Tunisia and Egypt, as I discussed, it's the role of the military, and it's this funding from U.S. sources. So if you look at Egypt, Egypt possesses the second most U.S. aid of any country of all time. It beats South Korea, it beats South Vietnam, and it beats Afghanistan. And that is because of this, the Camp David Accords, which caused the U.S. government to give Egypt over $1 billion in military funding each year, but it only receives $125 million of funding for its economics and for not just its economics, but its government, civil society, and things like that. That creates an entrenchment of Egypt as a power source. It not only entrenches it because it has more weapons, more soldiers, but it also entrenches it as this economic player. The Egyptian military is deeply entrenched in Egypt's economy, not just as an output and an input of resources, but also there's this system in which Egyptian generals, after they retire, they go into this private sector, they go into these companies. That gives it even more entrenchment. And when you have these funds flooding in, you're increasing corruption, you're increasing this place in the economy, which only entrenches it more. Compared to Tunisia, which you're starting to see that increase in 2011 to then 2020. But the key difference is that ostracization of the Tunisian military being put to the side compared to the Egyptian military and its ability to co-opt. And as I discussed, the role of the Egyptian military is seen as a leadership of Egypt historically compared to the Tunisian military, which was not the same. I hope I answered the question.
No,
it
it
went off
was
in a different direction.
No, it was very. I think this question that you answered about like the military and the Egypt and Tunisia I have a very similar question and like kind of related to it. Both Tunisia and Egypt had highlighted the trust in militaries in 2010, 2011. But we argue in this relationship, in this report, that the trust in the military is very kind of important to understand the likelihood of protesting or voting. And so can you explain why, if, for example, in Tunisia, there was like the military role in Tunisia and how it became later on like a stabilizing force, while, for example, in Egypt, it was embedded inside the revolution?
I think that's a really great point. The interesting thing about Tunisia is there's this perception of the military almost siding with the protesters and refusing to shoot bullets. And Nuland has actually done some really interesting research, talking to bloggers, people on the ground, and the source of that information. And it's come out that the military did support Ben Ali. It protected federal institutions that allowed the Ben Ali police forces to go and crack down on protesters. However, there was this perception in the revolution that the military was not taking on protesters. And this perception created a stabilizing factor because it created the perception that the military was on the side of the revolution. And that's huge for the protest and the momentum behind the protest, and then the momentum into the transition, where the military is then put in this role as a safeguard or as on the side of the revolution. When you compare that to the Egyptian armed forces, they came in and they came in and were seen as also a safeguard of the revolution, but having this previous leadership, they were able to co-opt the revolution, because when Morsi, who didn't have the cross-institutional trust and support of other institutions to go up against the military, it was just him and the Brotherhood whose trust levels were waning, while the military still had high trust. So the military's place as a well-trusted institution and its role in the revolution put it in this position where you have these two institutions, the democratically elected leader with low trust, and then the military, which is seen as a really stable, high trust organization. You're gonna see the people shift towards the military without a cross-institutional trust from the judiciary, which didn't have a high trust, or from other civil society parties, which were under the thumb of Mubarak, so they weren't well trusted or able to support the democracy.
That's a very good answer. Thank you. I want to go and talk to you because I know you worked with the State Department, you have experience on those, so you know more about like the resource allocations that usually the State Department works on it. So the report really discussed the democracy assistance and funding that have been provided to Tunisia. And so I think one of my questions is, from your State Department experience, why do you think these misallocations happen? And what was missing or not taken into considerations when the State Department was allocating those fundings to Tunisia? And what are maybe the bureaucratic, political, or strategic barriers to better target trust profiles when we are talking about democracy promotion?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I'm going to push back a little bit on the misallocation idea.
Okay.
Because I think it's something that people say a lot, the comparing the military aid to the economic support funds, and it's really not apples to apples. I think, military funding costs way more. I've worked in the Pentagon, I've worked in the State Department, and just been witnessing sort of, planes are way more expensive than a laptop for a civil society organization, for example. And so I think it's better for us to compare sort of countries or to compare over time, where the funding is going. But, I also think that the reason that a lot of funding went to Tunisia at that time for the military, in part, was because of what was going on around Tunisia. And I think, Libya was in the height of civil war at that point. And so the idea that you would be able to have a successful democratic transition without a stable Tunisia, I mean, Libyans were flooding into Tunisia, there were, a million Libyans crossing the border. And so this idea that you needed to make sure that Tunisia was safe and secure if you're gonna be able to have any success in putting forward any of the sort of political reforms. So I don't think it was wrong to fund the security forces to the extent that they did. Also, security sector reform was incredibly important. It was not fully successful, but if you do look at, kind of what came out of the US assistance for the military, it was the counterterrorism funds, and Tunisia today they're basically a military exporter. They are able to take care of their own problems without a lot of assistance from Europe and the United States, and that was a major success, I think, of assistance. But as far as the economic support, mean, one of the big criticisms at the time, and I do think this is where there were challenges, is that there was a ton of money that was put on the table in 2011 from the United States and Europe for the Arab Spring March.
Right.
And that money, was massive. I mean, this was money that would have really been beneficial to a lot of countries, but when it became clear by 2013, after the coup in Egypt, and then, every other country basically, besides Tunisia, the transition's not really moving forward, that money was kind of taken away. And I think this was something that I was at the State Department at the time that was really frustrating, was that, okay, so you said you have all this money to give to democratizing countries in the Middle East, why are you taking it away just because it's only Tunisia left? Why not just give it to Tunisia or give more of it to Tunisia? So I think this is where part of the problem is that, if we have to also go back to the fact that Tunisia, prior to the Arab Spring, had almost no relationship with the United States. They got pretty much no assistance, and didn't have really a diplomatic relationship. And so this idea, like, Tunisia was never important to the United States. And it was, and again, I saw this firsthand, that there was a lot of support, bipartisan support in Congress and the State Department. People loved Tunisia. They wanted to see Tunisia succeed. And Tunisia was important until anything else happened. So as soon as, again, Libya is happening, Syrian civil war is happening, Yemen. I mean, there's conflicts all over the region. So the bureaucratic challenge, I think, was like, how do you keep the attention on Tunisia and make it the argument that, we need to keep up the pressure. I mean, the other piece of this, and there's this really sad but really interesting video of when President Benji Qaidi came to Washington in 2015 and met with Obama. And the video of their meeting, Obama is sitting there saying, look, Tunisia's great, we love it, you're doing a great job, leader of the Arab Spring, blah, blah, blah. And Essebsi is like begging, and he's like, we are not done, we need your help, please don't abandon us, don't think that we've succeeded. And I think this is the big lesson of democracy promotion that fails frequently, is that once you kind of get past your first elections, once you get the constitution written, the international community kind of says, okay, you're check box, but let's move on to a different country now. And that, I think, is the
I totally agree. I think that's the problem. That's the problem. We can't abandon the country once they have a constitution, because this is the thing. You have to continue investing in those institutions. I think that's. I know you have a forthcoming book that really examines external actors, the role of external actors in democratic transitions. And I want to talk more about the book and the arguments and the current the discussions on, can foreign democracy assistance actually distort or undermine democratic trust, domestic trust patterns, and under what conditions does external support help versus really hurt the promotion of democracy, based on your research?
No, thank you. I mean, this book project it's been fascinating. It started with Tunisia. I'm looking at the first decade of democratic transitions to understand the role of external actors in helping and hurting. And I think one of the things that, this project was driven by the fact that I would go to Tunisia and people would ask me all the time, what did they do well in Eastern Europe? What did they do well in Latin America? So I wanted to find that out. So I've been looking at cases, the earliest cases, Portugal, 1974, all the way to Tunisia, which has just been so interesting to see at what points, I mean, this exact argument that we were just talking about, that, this is very common, that countries get abandoned, early on. As soon as you kind of are successful, the international community turns their back on you. And that first decade is so crucial. And I think this is, again, where Tunisia, it could have made a big difference if the aid levels had been consistent, the same that they were in 2011, 2012, kept that up through, the next decade. But I do think, there are many instances where foreign assistance, particularly US assistance and European assistance, can be harmful. And I think this is one of the challenges, particularly when you're talking about trust, is that, if that assistance, if it looks like the transition is being led and driven by foreign interests, that's like number one trust killer. This has to, and in the Tunisian and Egyptian case, these were homegrown revolutions. These were, especially in Tunisia, the first of the Arab Spring. This was not due to U.S. democracy promotion by any means. There was no U.S. democracy promotion happening prior to 2011. And so there is always that risk that if the United States comes in and sort of drops a bunch of money on civil society is seen as co-opted. It's not seen as genuine, and that can really harm trust. And I think that's a line that Western democracy promoters have to walk. And then when we talk about European assistance, which I know is not the focus here, but that particularly in North Africa, you're talking about former colonial powers,
Right.
there's a whole other layer on there too, so it can be harmful. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't give assistance, but you have to be careful how you do it and make sure that that assistance is benefiting, grassroots organizations that have credibility.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also like part of the trust issue too is like capitals versus rural areas. And, in the Tunisian case, revolution was led from the interior of the country. I went and interviewed a bunch of civil society activists in the interior. And what I heard from them was that like, they didn't even trust Tunis-based Tunisian NGOs, and so often, US assistance was going mostly to Tunis.
Right.
And if that's what you're doing, you're not supporting the organizations that are on the ground that have the trust of the local population. It's gonna really backfire.
Which is exactly what we are trying to argue about here. Maybe we should build a profile about which institutions we actually trust to receive this money and which institutions we have to reconsider our options. Henry, I want to talk to you about because we're talking about aid and we're talking about money, I want to talk more about the Tunisian aid breakdown. You did a lot of work in case study on Tunisia, and the research shows that US gave Tunisia over 100 million, and then billions to the military, but did not support a similar level for civil society, and the judiciary and the political parties. And so if we could, if you could redesign the allocation from 2010, 2011, so what percentage do you think would go for the military, for the judiciary, or what do you think about this distribution?
I think it's a great question. I think some really great points have been made about the cost of a jet versus a laptop. And I think I would look at our research and I would look into what things later on in 2015, 2016, when we're being asked for support, when that first election's already happened, which institutions being increased with funding, which trust being utilized and fostered leads to more voter turnout, to increase the value of that democracy, to strengthen that democracy. So we see that in the judiciary, we see that with political parties, it's strengthening these political institutions, and not just the court system itself, but your individual judges, your individual lawyers, supporting those important role models and figures that were important for the transition process and were important in the revolution, were figures in the revolution. I think that is something that should have been utilized more, and maybe playing a role in the support. You might have some insight on that. And I think, yes, security is very important. I think that's a great point, but I think I'm not a military strategist, but I know that per dollar used at certain levels, there's marginal return, and I know there can often be with U.S. military assistance over emphasis. So while you still are going to put a lot of money into security practices, I think when it comes to the police, maybe not all of that money goes to equipment and counterterrorism training. Maybe some of it goes into local community building and trust building, because that is really important for building trust in society. And I think, as been discussed, using more local actors and using more local actors in the hinterland, in the interior, which is something I think the U.S. can struggle with because of its outsider perspective. It's harder. So I think trust, that would be my recommendations.
Yes, you talked about the military, and we know in the report we did talk about the military too. And you cite striking examples of the U.S. providing a large amount of money to the M1 Abrams tanks, and they're unused right now in the Egyptian warehouse. And so this seems like an obvious policy failure, but the United States providing a lot of military support to Egypt, but then they're not using those military support and they're unused. And so why do you think this has continued to happen? Like, we are giving military to the Egyptian army, it's unused, it's sitting there and wasting our resources, whereas we can use that money for, all the options that we're talking about it right now. Well, political or bureaucratic factors, I guess, prevents this.
I think it's historical, and it's also an internal cultural preference of the Egyptian military. I think you have this historical connection to the Abraham Accords. You have this continuous high budget to the Egyptian military, to the point where you're providing tanks that aren't being used, they're sitting in warehouses. And I think a part of this is also the Tunisian military, and the top generals especially, really favor high price tag, large military equipment. It's seen as a status symbol, and so you've got a high influence with that. But how many tanks do you need to govern Cairo? Probably not as many if you have them stacked up in warehouses. And I think it's a symptom of the over $1 billion that is provided every year, a symptom of the cultural preference towards items that are not essential to their security needs internally or currently externally.
Can I respond to?
Yes,
Yeah, I think
please.
you're absolutely right, and I think even in the Tunisian case, I remember at one point there was like a wish list that was handed to the US government of this is what the Tunisian military wants. And it was very much about what you're talking about, the status symbol, and I remember like the generals looking at it and being like, these are not things you need. Like, we wanna help you and we wanna help you in counterterrorism, but like, you don't need these big prestige things, which are expensive and are gonna sit in a warehouse. And so I think that's the typical problem, but it's also like you wanna deliver on what they want, and so there was all this back and forth. But I think on the broader assistance piece, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that like part of the police training, where I think one of the biggest failures in the Tunisian case was that they passed this really amazing law against gender-based violence that was
Right.
really, really, impressive globally, not just for Tunisia. And one of the failures there was like the lack of education for police and for the judiciary. So, women would, learn that they could go to the police. Part of the law was that they were supposed to have a female police officer in every police station, so that if a woman is facing gender-based violence, she could go to that, feel more comfortable going to a woman. That was never implemented. They didn't educate the police or the courts on how do you actually adjudicate some of this. And so, this is just one example of, I think, some of these failures where you have the difference between kind of what exists on paper and then what is actually playing out in reality. They miss the mark. And I think a lot of that, when you're trying to figure out assistance and how do you actually tie the assistance to what is already, being put in place, you could have done a lot more there.
So to talk about more about the framework, because I know you also worked on that, we kind of make an argument in the report that at certain threshold there might be some violence happening in the country, like the low government trust versus high trust in civil society. We expect protests to happen. I think one of the question is, what is really the threshold? Like, how would you see this happening, and at what level of threshold this can lead to an uprisings?
I think there's no same threshold for each country or for each organization,
Right.
but I think it really comes down to where the population, where these protesters place their trust and how they're protesting. Are they putting their trust in a government and then protesting for reform in that government, or have they so little trust in that government and have larger trust in political institutions outside that they're protesting out of desperation and no longer feel that the government's productive? And I think you can trace that threshold to when one or multiple political institutions become pillars of trust and stability, and the central government and the political parties and or the military or security institutions are declining, and the difference between those declines. So there's no same one, but I think that is.
I think because you talked about how every country is different, I think we're also talking about like moving from one size fits all approach. And so you identify different strategy scenarios based on trust profile, civil society, and mobilizing as how those factors can be mobilizing the trust in institutions. I want to ask the questions in the case of a policymakers who have limited resources to provide, and given the current situations that we are in the current administrations, how can we quickly, more efficiently diagnose if a country is experiencing or is about to experience an uprising, and then do the necessary intervention given the current political conditions that we are in and the limited resources that we have?
I think it's the first thing you have to do, as the first thing a policymaker has to do, is decide on what their goal is. If it's to analyze stability or to boost democracy, is it to stabilize the regime or to promote democracy? And I think there's two different, because you're either working on increasing voter turnout or working on decreasing instability. And I think the thing you target first is, of course, civil society, which has been tried and true, but with this nuanced approach of understanding that different civil society, especially local civil society, is really important to invest in. And then I think the judiciary follows that, because the legitimacy of the judiciary, while it can increase protest, I think if you have the legitimacy of the judiciary as well as the legitimacy of the civil society increased in tandem, as long as you don't let the government decrease too much, you can maintain stability. But if the government does start decreasing and continuously decreasing, then you need to work to increase the stability of the security apparatus as long as that, and not just the stability, pardon me, the trust in the security apparatus alongside that. And that trifecta can counter the continuing government and be perceived, as well as, of course, coming in for political parties, but that's all of them. So I would break down political parties as well as the judiciary and the civil society first, and working with the nuanced profiles in each one.
That's a very relevant and very makes sense answer. Sarah, I want to go back to the conversation about trust monitoring in practice. And so I want to talk about let's make the scenario that if you as policymakers had been monitoring what's going on in Tunisia instead of abandoning Tunisia. And since the 2010-2011, as the report really recommends, what specific policy adjustments do you think would have been advocated for in the 2015, for example, or 2016? Because we know what happened, they abandoned it. So what do you think a policy recommendation or adjustment would have done that could have prevented where we are right now in Tunisia?
I think, so what the US was doing in 2015, 2016, it wasn't fully abandoning, but it was certainly backing off of the massive levels of assistance that we saw between 2011 and 2013. But I think, what they were focused on again was the political reform process. And so there was a lot of money the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute and Dania and IRI spent a lot of time and energy on political parties and civil society. That's where they got their bread and butter. They were, particularly IRI was working with every single political party. But it didn't, I don't fault them, but it didn't materialize into the trust that, people were still losing trust in political parties. But I think the challenge was addressing the economic situation. And part of this, I think one of the things that we have to think about if you're designing an intervention is that there's only so much the US can do from the outside. This has to be driven by local actors. And the fact that the political parties and, the up until to the top, even, in the Democratic executive, they were not interested in addressing the economic reforms. So even if the US had gone in, one of the things we talked about was conditioning assistance, like the IMF loan, was supposed to be conditioned on making these economic reforms. And the IMF just kept saying, well, we don't want Tunisia to fail, so we're just going to keep giving them money, even though they haven't taken on the economic reforms they're supposed to. I think that was one of the big challenges. And a lot of it is these economic reforms take time to actually bear fruit, especially the anti-corruption efforts. They started going after corruption on day one. It was the first thing that they tackled the day after the revolution was anti-corruption, but they just weren't there yet. And I think, unfortunately for Tunisia's case, they had made a lot of really good progress, but again, it wasn't trickling down economically into people's daily lives. And that's where, I don't know how you would have reformed policy. You have to get the political actors to buy into wanting to make those economic reforms, and they just simply weren't. And so all the assistance in the world, I don't think could have done anything there. One of the things I do think the US could have done differently is some sort of bridging loan or something that would have helped. The economic reforms by design would have caused short-term economic pain. The US could have come in with Europe and said, we get that, but we're gonna make sure it doesn't cause pain. We're gonna give you this money, this loan to sort of bridge until the economic reforms start bearing fruit. And that was not something that they were really interested in doing at the time.
Thank you for this answer. So as we are, after all that conversation we had on Tunisia, as we are moving forward and looking forward for this country, despite the current backslidings and the current challenges that we have, do you share the optimisms or pessimisms about what's happening in Tunisia and the democratic civil society involvement there, and who do you think it's really being risky for them, who are at risk right now in Tunisia and the political situation?
Yeah,
and my last question is, do you see this overturning into a complete authoritarian system in Tunisia?
Yeah, I think it's already there, honestly.
Okay.
I'm generally an optimistic person. I'm not optimistic about Tunisia, in part because I think there's been a global shift against democracy. I mean, not that the whole world's against democracy, but that, we've seen autocracy growing. We've seen in the United States, I think we should be under zero illusion that there will be any effort of democracy promotion over the next, 4 years. And so, and who knows after that. So I think that there's not going to be any, there isn't democracy promotion right now explicitly on behalf of this administration. So that's not going to help. And in Europe as well, I think we're seeing a shift away. I also think, like, as we talk about this, the United States is an important player. Europe is a much, much more important player when it comes to North Africa. Egypt is a different case. We are the biggest donor to Egypt. But, when it comes to Tunisia, Europe, really dwarfs what we do. And I think so what we're seeing in the EU as well, I was actually in Brussels not that long ago talking to the EU democracy promoters about North Africa, trying to figure out what to get in their heads and see what's happening. And for them, it's just migration. That's all they care about. They don't care about democracy promotion. They're not interested in democracy promotion. They just want to shut down the borders and make sure the boats aren't getting to Italy. So I'm very pessimistic in that sense that the external actors who in the past certainly were not perfect, but were the drivers of a lot of the democracy promotion in Tunisia, they're absent now. And so I think, and it's growing harder and harder for Tunisian civil society to have a role. A lot of them are here in the US, a lot of them are in Europe now, and they are doing their best, like from afar, to both protect themselves and their lives and their families, but then also figure out what can you do, as a diaspora community to someday return. And I do hope, I do have try to be positive. I do think it's someday Tunisia will return to democracy. I don't think the story's over. I think especially once they did so much in those first couple of years to build institutions, to build civil society. I don't think that's just totally dead, but I think it's very much on pause right
What
now.
do you think the United States role here would be in this situation? And I have the same question for Henry as well about the United States involvement.
I just don't, there's no interest in Tunisia, period, right now.
Okay.
And I think actually, one really interesting data point is that they just confirmed the new US ambassador to Tunisia, who is the first ever political appointee. It's always been a career foreign service officer, someone who knows the region, someone who's experienced. For the first time ever, we have a political appointee, which doesn't, not all political appointees are terrible, but it's a signal that there's a different emphasis now on, this person doesn't have a background in Tunisia, is not likely, they're there to do economic development or get US businesses involved in Tunisia. So I have very little, I don't think the US is going to be doing anything in Tunisia for the foreseeable future. It was hard to get attention on Tunisia when at the peak of the Arab Spring, and now it's like no one unfortunately is paying much attention.
Okay. Perfect, thank you. I have the same question for Henry as we wrapping up the conversation.
I think I'm also pessimistic for similar reasons. And I think an important thing to acknowledge with US intervention, especially now in Tunisia, is the current regime has been almost beating the drum a little bit on how these civil society organizations are supported by Europe and the US, which makes it even harder for us to get involved. And I think our opportunity to be involved was that 15, 16, 17, 18 period, which we stepped back in. And I think it's hard for us to do intervention in Tunisia right now. I think there's a reason for it to not be, but I think hopefully the opportunity will present itself in the future. It's got a very highly educated population. It's got a really fleshed out legal population, that the young class of lawyers that I was describing in the cities, that presents some hopeful positive trend lines for democracy moving forward. So hopefully an opportunity will present itself for the US to follow proactive policy and not reactive policy like we've discussed moving forward. Because right now we're in a reactive stance and it won't be effective. So if we had taken proactive, then hopefully we'll have the opportunity to take proactive.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Henry. We can open right for Q&A for questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a Middle East analyst here at New Lines, mostly focusing on Palestine, Israel, but additionally human rights issues across the region. My question is, Dania and Henry, in your report you talk a lot about maybe the fact that maybe we should be reallocating funds from civil society to institutions that are maybe better at promoting democracy. And I'm wondering what institutions you're particularly thinking about. For me, a lot of the times, like some of these countries in the region, the regime does not want to democratize. And so if that is the case, is taking funds away from civil society the best option, especially in countries where there are regimes that aren't wanting to democratize, and those civil society organizations are really the bulk of the society that is promoting any kind of democracy. So I'm wondering what kinds of institutions do you have in mind when you're speaking about reallocating funds away that will promote democracy in a lot of these regimes that are really not looking to democratize?
Yeah, I think a really great opportunity for that in particular that comes to mind is internal security apparatuses. We see a correlation between those and stability and democracy, and we often fund, in a lot of fragile states, internal security apparatus, and tying that funding to community building and trust initiatives through that could be a way to promote democracy without going to the regime and saying, hey, we want to give money to your judiciary to promote democracy, but saying, hey, part of our funding we want to go to community building programs with your security apparatus, which we feel would build out a higher voter turnout and a lower protest turnout.
Sure, but do you feel like there's a way to give that money without it actually being allocated towards entrenching authoritarianism? I think a lot of the times, like the internal security apparatuses are inherently tied to the regime. And so I'm wondering, is there a way that the US and maybe Sarah, you can speak a little bit more to this given your experience, but is there a way for the US to give the money with conditions that it goes to those community building kind of projects, or do you feel that a lot of times the money goes to where it's going to go and it's in the hands of the regime?
Yeah, I mean, I would not support taking money from civil society and giving it to internal security. I think for multiple reasons. I mean, one is exactly the point that you're making, that I think that the internal security forces often are and they certainly need help and need to be reformed. And a lot of that was happening in Tunisia. I mean, and still is, frankly. I mean, hasn't been super effective, but was a lot of security sector reform, a lot of programs. The U.S. Institute of Peace was very involved in implementing a lot of these programs in Tunisia. But I think, what you need civil society as the watchdog of everything that's happening. And so you need it to be watching the internal security and saying like, hey, this is what they're doing, and I just think that you're also talking about that likely moving money from like economic support funds to the foreign military financing account, which I think is not a great plan. I think rather keeping it, plus enough civil society to serve, also to be the trainers of internal security, have partnerships between civil society and the internal security forces to help build trust there.
I have another question. I think it's a good segue. I'm wondering, when I think of vibrant civil society, I often think of Palestinian civil society. It's one of the most vibrant kind of civil society organizations, groups kind of in the region for a variety of reasons, of course, given they kind of don't really have a very functioning centralized government. So that opens up the opportunity for a really vibrant civil society. But I'm wondering in other cases, and especially maybe the cases that you guys have, the case studies that you guys have studied, what role do you think local civil society could play in rebuilding or maintaining public trust in some of these regimes, if that's kind of the focus of the report? What do you think civil society could be doing better to promote more public trust in maybe the governments that they're operating under?
I think one approach to look at this is how much the civil society receives funding from the government. The book by Barrier to Democracy by Dr. Jamal looked at this. Civil society organizations that receives funding from the government, they are less trusted than civil society organizations who do not receive funding or support from the government. If the government really influences and shapes your financial relationships, this tends to impact your freedoms to act and behave the way you want to behave and to criticize the government. I think this is one thing. Another thing, civil society organizations, their activities have to be approved by the government before they actually can execute and do their activities. And so if you have this independency that you can do your activities or your events without getting an approval from the government, this is likely to increase your trust in the government, your trust in the people, because you have this independency. I think those are the two factors that are really key in terms of like shaping trust in civil society. It's like first, where do you get your money from, and then how much the government influence and shapes your activities.
But do you think there's a way that civil society can help rebuild trust in some of these governments? Like, do you think that there is a way for them to collaborate to have better public trust in like the government so that there's maybe less likely of a chance for like destabilizing or instability?
I think there is a potential, but this depends on how the civil society perceives the governments. Because civil society have connections with the people and they're actually closer to the people than the government. If civil society perceives the government as ineffective or inefficient, and so there's no way to continue working with the current regimes and we must have a regime change, then the likelihood of civil society actually be the mediator, like establishing the trust, is very difficult. And this will impact the relationships.
Thanks.
Just, I think, in Tunisia, one of the best examples, successful examples, I think, of civil society was an organization called El Balsala that had this basically like a parliamentary monitor. And I think the way they can build trust is through transparency. And so they had, and this was a really impressive thing that we don't even have in the United States, where you had this like website that they would have someone, their volunteers would sit in the parliament every day and basically like live stream or live, text what was happening. They had profiles of every single member of parliament. They recorded all of their votes, and it was all in one place. And so people could see, and that way, not only is it giving information to the public for people who want to see what's happening, but also it gives that pressure on the members of parliament to say, like, we're watching you, no matter what you say, like, we're going to be there and we're recording what you're saying, we're recording your votes, we're going to hold you accountable. And I think that it's the two-way street of like, civil society can like scream into the ether of like, being the watchdog, but if the government doesn't feel like they are responsible or that they're being held accountable, then it's not going to really matter. So I do think that kind of like back and forth, and it can also diminish trust because you can start to see like, oh, they said they were going to do this and they're not doing that. But I think that's just part of like the growth of a healthy democracy.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ava Gilder. I'm also a student fellow at New Lines. I have two questions for you. One of them more for Henry and Dania, and then the second one's for the group. In your lessons learned portion of your presentation, you talked a little bit about how women and men trust differently in the government. And I'd be curious to know, first of all, the breakdown of those values, whether or not the trust aspect for women is the same or in Egypt and Tunisia, especially because of Tunisia is typically thought to be a pioneer of women's rights. And Egypt and Tunisia have pretty different laws in terms of reproductive rights for women in their countries. Do you think that this difference can cause this difference in the way that each country views women or has laws around women's rights can change what's happening right now? And do you think that women can be a driver for change in this current environment?
Sure. So just to rephrase the question, so if women can be a driver, right, like of a change in the political system?
Yeah, I mean, so Tunisia and Egypt, they have different reproductive laws, which I would be curious about the breakdown of those values. But do you think that being the current state of laws for women in those two different states, do you see women being able to participate and be a driver for change in the current environment and involved in civil society organizations more as much as men are?
I'm more positive and more optimistic about women in civil society and in Tunisia, especially in Tunisia.
Yeah.
I'm very positive and optimistic for women in Tunisia than in Egypt, for different reasons. But and I still see women being more drivers of change in those economies than in Egypt for different reasons. Women have been always like champions and leaders in Tunisia. Yeah. We've seen this with the recent law that passed for women in Tunisia and the activists. But just to highlight about this, I think one thing we talked about in the report when it comes to women and men is like women tend to interact with institutions that are different than what men tend to interact with. And so women tend to interact more with the courts or with civil society organizations, and so they tend to have high trust in those institutions. But then men tend to interact more with the military or the police institution, so they tend to have high trust in those institutions more. And so your interactions really shapes your attitude and your trust with this organization.
And do you think that their, I guess, like women and men's relationship with these two different institutions is based on, I guess, the system of governance and the way that women or men are treated in their various countries? Because, for example, like in different countries, you have women more in the military or the security sector than in other countries. So I'd be curious to hear about that too.
I think Sarah also can add to this, but I think also it has to do with like the gender context.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. I feel there's also a gender component. There's serious gender concerns in those two economies that I know you also have expertise on this that if you feel wanna add to it too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, the way that women in Tunisia in particular have played a role since independence. I mean, it's something that President Bourguiba like really focused on. You know, he was very much like a secularist and wanted to have gender equality, and I think it's one of the things that during the revolution or during the good years of democracy, Tunisia was one of the best performing countries when it came to gender participation, gender equality in government globally. You know, and President Said, I think interestingly, who is definitely not of that camp and didn't really care about women's rights and kind of set women's rights back. But he still felt the societal pressure to appoint a female prime minister, even though that person had no actual role or like didn't have any power. But you know, that for him, I think he understood the context in which he was operating, that gender equality does matter and people are paying attention. So yeah, I think and in the case of Egypt, it's just a much more challenging situation for women over time, and there hasn't been that same sort of pressure. And I do think the fact that the military is so like drives so much of the country that women are not really involved in the military has a big impact.
Yeah, thank you. And then my second question is more about your policy recommendations. I really liked how you spoke about the fact that one size does not necessarily fit all. And I wanted to ask you if these policy recommendations are implemented, do you see the US changing their relationship with Tunisia? I know right now also because of the tariffs earlier this year that Trump put on Tunisia, that also strained the relationship a little bit. So I'd be also interested to hear what you guys have to say about that.
I think the current administration, like we sort of addressed earlier, is not going to change its relationship with Tunisia. I think if maybe down the line in the next administration and the one after that, if Tunisia changes its current trajectory, there's a possibility. But I don't foresee the State Department choosing to fight an uphill battle, especially as we see this reduction in funds going overseas by the current administration.
Do you think that there's something that could incentivize the US government to participate in it? Like protests or something like that if something were to come up again?
Yes, I think that could be a possibility, but they would have to be on
pretty incentivized.
Incentivized and very escalatory protests or regime change. And even with that happening, it's still a global order that the US is currently retreating from. So it would have to be in the next administration. I don't see this administration turning on the dime with its current foreign policy strategy.
And I think like we have a sort of real life scenario playing out right now in Morocco, where you are seeing the biggest protests since the Arab Spring. And I mean, so far, they're still very much unfolding, so we don't really know where this is going to go. But I think it'll be interesting to see what the U.S. response is, you know, similar sort of relationship right now. But yeah, I just wanted one thing to flag on that, this idea of the one size fits all and not having one size fits all approach. I completely agree. And I just wanted to mention, you know, one of the positive things that came out of the U.S. response to Arab Spring was really for the first time they developed a sort of rapid response funding mechanism, because one of the challenges, and I think we should be obviously taking a much more proactive rather than reactive approach. But one of the challenges to that is that it takes so long to change policy. It takes even funding, you know, takes like multiple years to implement a grant. And so that kind of there was a lot of flack given about that like, hey, this Arab Spring happened and now you don't, like, it took so long to even just respond. So they did develop much more, it's still not sufficient, but at least a way to kind of respond in real time to things that are changing on the ground. I think there could be much more done in that space to get at what you guys are advocating for, which I agree with, which is like, you need to be able to really get into the weeds on your policy rather than just kind of like keeping moving forward on these policies that are not effective anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you for this brilliant presentation. I'm Ayman Al-Faisal from the Iraqi Embassy. I'm in charge for the think tanks in the embassy. Let me quick asking for Mr. Henry. I have a question for you for the why you did take the Iraqi as an example for your topics. What is your review of the democratic experience in Iraq? We had, as you know, we had the protest movement in 2019. So, and we have also a big change after that date for the change the government and the parliament. And also we have the higher level for the trust in the judiciary also. Thank you.
And sorry, so what is the core question?
The main question is why you don't take the Iraqi experience democracy as an example for your topics?
Well, I think a big reason that we chose Tunisia as well as Egypt for our case studies is that they had the most holistic air barometer data for us to compare it to. So it was from a data perspective, and then also with Tunisia having this reputation around the Arab Spring and the unique relationship that U.S. foreign aid has to Egypt, they're what came to the forefront. But I think future reports would really benefit from looking into Iraq, and I think there's a lot of potential of looking into the trend lines, and I think that's a great point.
Thank you.
Yeah, to add to Henry, it's the Arab barometer data. It's a survey firm. So when it's a survey process, and so when they collect their data every year, they ask the same questions, but the questions are not being asked in all the countries at the same time. So every year it depends on the accessibility of the data that they have. So definitely the Iraq has a very active and vibrant civil society, but from the data perspective, we want to be able to cover as much as we can countries to increase the validations of our argument that it doesn't apply only in one country, but it also applies in other countries. But yes, totally, I agree with you.
Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions? Okay. Any from the online attendees? Or there's online? No? Okay. I think we can wrap up early today. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care.